Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into what is honestly the ultimate scientific mystery. Just think about the ground beneath your feet for a second. The rocks in your garden, the water in the ocean. How on earth did non-living matter, stuff like stones, soil, and water, somehow miraculously transform into living, breathing, incredibly complex organisms? Basically, how did the raw building blocks of the Earth eventually become, well, you?
It's a question that's been haunting philosophers and scientists for literally centuries. When you really stop to look at the sheer complexity of a single cell, let alone a whole human being, it almost feels impossible. So, did the very first living thing just spark into existence through divine intervention? Was it like a magical breath of life inhaled by dust? Or, I don't know, maybe it was some kind of alien microbe that hitched a ride on a meteorite and crashed into our newly formed planet? Well, the truth we're uncovering in this explainer is actually far stranger and honestly way more fascinating than fiction.
To kick off this journey, let's look at an absolutely absurd but totally true fact. Your DNA, that incredibly complex genetic code that makes you, is literally 60% identical to a banana's DNA. Yep, you heard that right. You and a piece of fruit share a really deep cosmic link. And it's not just bananas. This applies to every animal, plant, fungus, and algae on this entire planet. If you rewind the clock far enough, we all share the exact same well, you get the idea, 100 millionth great-grandparent.
That mind-blowing shared DNA points directly back to one specific microscopic ancestor. Scientists call it LUCA, the last universal common ancestor. It was this tiny, single-celled microbe living in tropical places roughly 3.7 billion years ago. Every single living thing on Earth evolved from this one little organism. But, of course, that just brings us to the core mystery of our explainer. LUCA was alive, sure, but there were things before it. So, how did LUCA or its immediate predecessors actually come alive in the first place?
Section 1. Debunking the life force. How science proved life is just a chemical process. Okay, let's dive into this. Up until about 200 years ago, most scientists were pretty convinced that living things possessed this magical, unexplainable energy. They called it the life force. And hey, it was a comforting thought, right? The idea that there was this invisible, special barrier separating living creatures from inanimate rocks. But science is relentless. A few brilliant minds decided to actually put this life force to the test. Let's walk through this timeline really quick because it shows how rapidly the whole myth was deconstructed. Back in the 1780s, a French chemist named Antoine Lavoisier measured a guinea pig's body heat by seeing how fast it melted ice, and then he compared it to a piece of burning coal. Turns out, they released the exact same amount of carbon dioxide and melted the same amount of ice. His conclusion? Life is just a chemical process. Fast forward a decade, and Luigi Galvani thought he'd found the life force when a steel blade made a dead frog's legs twitch. He called it animal electricity. But then Alessandro Volta proved it was literally just a chemical reaction between the metals, a discovery that, fun fact, led directly to the invention of the electric battery. But the real nail in the coffin was in 1828. Friedrich Fuller accidentally synthesized organic urine, which is the stuff found in human urine, using completely inorganic chemicals. No life force required. By the 1850s, Marceline Berthelot was successfully whipping up complex organic compounds in a lab using nothing but carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. Science had definitively proved that we basically operate on sheer chemistry.
Section 2. The 4 rules of life. Deconstructing what it actually means to be alive. But okay, if we're all just a bunch of chemicals, what actually defines life? If there's no magical life force, what separates you from, say, a puddle of organic chemicals? In 2011, a biophysicist named Edward Trivonov analyzed 123 different definitions of life, and he found a general consensus. Life is self-reproduction with variation. But to really wrap our heads around how non-living things transitioned into living things, we need to break that down even further. We've got a 4-step biological checklist. To go from a rock to an organism, you absolutely need 4 things. First, complexity. You need the chemical compounds found in living beings. Second, replication. The ability to reproduce or copy oneself, kind of like DNA. Third, a boundary. Some sort of physical barrier separating the organism from its environment. And fourth, metabolism. The ability to consume something for energy and then release waste. This checklist, it's our roadmap for understanding how completely non-living elements gradually ticked off every single box over billions of years.
So, let's tackle rule number 1, complexity. Where did the incredibly complex organic raw materials needed for life actually come from? There are 2 main ideas here. The first is the panspermia theory, which argues that life's building blocks didn't even originate on Earth. They were actually delivered here by comets and meteors crashing down. The second idea is the primordial soup hypothesis, which suggests that life formed right here on our planet, in hot, chemical-rich ponds that were getting constantly zapped by lightning.
Now, I know the panspermia theory sounds like straight-up science fiction, but we actually have astonishing evidence that space is, practically speaking, a giant chemical factory. Back in 1969, the Murchison meteorite crashed in Australia. When scientists cracked it open, they found over 20 amino acids inside, literally the basic building blocks of life. And it gets crazier. Deep in the Sagittarius B2 cloud, which is 25,000 light-years away, we've spotted molecules displaying something called chirality. That's a specific left- and right-handedness structure that is a fundamental signature of life on Earth. We've even found glycoaldehyde floating in deep space clouds, which is a direct chemical precursor to the sugars that make up DNA. No way, right?
This string of discoveries led the scientist James Lovelock to say, "The universe is like a big warehouse with all the spare parts required for life available in it." It completely shifts how you look at things, doesn't it? Earth didn't necessarily need to cook up its own complex molecules from scratch. The universe had already done a ton of the heavy lifting. But hey, the earthbound primordial soup hypothesis holds some serious weight too. In 1953, Stanley Miller and Harold Urey ran this famous experiment. They set up a massive glass container, filled it with inorganic ammonia gas, methane gas, and water vapor, basically trying to replicate the super harsh conditions of early Earth. Then they zapped it with electric sparks to simulate lightning storms. And guess what? Within weeks, those simple inorganic chemicals spontaneously transformed into complex organic amino acids. It was a massive deal. It proved that highly improbable, yet perfect conditions right here on Earth could naturally generate the building blocks of life.
All right, let's move on and see how this builds into our second rule, replication. So you have this soup of complex chemicals floating around, but how do they start copying themselves? Enter the clay mineral hypothesis. It turns out the simple electrically charged surfaces of clay act as a natural binding platform. The clay literally gives organic molecules a place to stick, concentrate, assemble, and link together. Over an unimaginably long stretch of time, these chained molecules formed RNA. And RNA is absolutely crucial because it can store genetic information and, importantly, self-replicate.
And this brilliantly illustrates our third rule, boundary. You've got self-replicating RNA, which is great, but it needs protection from the elements. Think about what happens when you wash your hands. Soap molecules have a hydrophilic part that loves water and a hydrophobic part that absolutely hates it. Because of this dynamic, they naturally curl up into little spherical structures that trap dirt and oil inside, allowing you to wash them down the drain. Well, fatty acids in the primordial oceans did the exact same thing. They turned into lipids, naturally forming these tiny protective bubbles in the water that trapped chemicals inside, safely separating them from the chaotic environment outside. This accidental trapping was a game changer. When that self-replicating RNA got caught inside one of those protective lipid bubbles, it formed what we call a protocell. These are the absolute simplest, most primitive ancestors of modern cells. For the very first time in Earth's history, you had a distinct entity with its own internal genetics, totally walled off from the rest of the world.
Which brings us to the final rule on our checklist, metabolism. These new little protocells needed fuel to power their replication. Deep down on the ocean floor, there are these hydrothermal vents, constantly blasting out scorching hot, mineral-rich water. The hydrothermal vent theory suggests that early protocells gathered right around these vents. They literally trap the nutrients floating in the water, use the extreme heat as chemical energy to build up more RNA and lipids, and then release their waste. They were successfully actively feeding themselves.
Section 3. The Great Cellular Merger. How simple cells joined forces to create complex life.
Now, hydrothermal vents are basically just tiny little oases in a massive, freezing cold ocean. As protocells multiplied and eventually drifted away from these vents, they lost their easy, free source of heat and nutrients. So to survive, they had to start doing something pretty dramatic. They had to start eating each other, or cooperating with each other. At this point in history, life was strictly microscopic. You had prokaryotes, which are very simple, single-celled organisms like bacteria and archaea. But how do we get from those invisible little blobs to eukaryotes? Eukaryotes being the complex, multicellular organisms, the plants, the animals, and eventually us. While the jump from simple cells to complex life is honestly one of the most remarkable stories in all of biology.
Picture this. About 2 billion years ago, populations of archaea and bacteria were living in super close proximity in the oceans. It was a pretty good mutually beneficial setup. The bacteria would actually feed on the archaea's cellular waste. Win-win, right? Well, over millions of years, they got closer and closer, until an incredible biological accident occurred. A bacteria cell actually entered an archaea cell entirely. But instead of destroying each other, the archaea just tolerated it. They merged. One cell literally became a permanent, living tenant inside another, forming the very first ancestor of all complex multicellular life.
And you want to know the truly mind-blowing part? We literally still have proof of this today inside our own bodies. Back in the 1960s, American biologist Lynn Margulis was researching mitochondria, the tiny power plants inside our human cells that generate our energy. She looked at their DNA and realized something totally shocking. The DNA of our mitochondria does not match the rest of our human DNA. It actually perfectly matches a bacteria called typhus. The energy factories inside our own bodies used to be completely separate, independent bacteria that merged with us billions of years ago. How wild is that?
And that merger, it changed the entire world. By taking in these bacteria to act as dedicated internal power plants, these newly formed eukaryotic cells could command an insane amount of energy. To put it in perspective, they had 200,000 times more energy than a simple bacterial cell. With 200,000 times more power, cells could finally afford to grow larger, develop incredibly complex genes, and start clumping together to form multicellular life. It was the fuel for the massive evolutionary leap that eventually resulted in towering trees, giant dinosaurs, and yes, human beings. So the transition from non-living chemicals floating in space to living, breathing, thinking organisms, it didn't happen in a flash. It was this agonizingly slow, gradual chain of coincidences over 2 billion years. The right raw materials, the perfect environmental conditions, random lightning strikes, tiny lipid bubbles, and microscopic mergers. When you truly grasp the cosmic scale of this giant chemical puzzle, that old cliché rings undeniably true. We are all, quite literally, made of stardust.
It took the universe billions of years of random chemical experimentation, deep space manufacturing, and ocean floor evolution just to assemble the biological machine that is you. So, knowing the incredible, astronomically unlikely string of coincidences that had to happen perfectly for you to be sitting here right now, how will you look at the natural world around you today? Think about that the next time you look at a stone, a puddle of water, or even a banana. Keep exploring, and thanks for watching The Explainer.